Perfection is both a friend and enemy of growth.
We have fortunate faith as we're brave misfortune, and fortunate faith builds the kingdom on earth.
Hi there, and welcome to Fortunate Faith. I'm life coach practitioner Katelyn Townsend, and this is my co-host Tom. And today we're going to be talking about what makes a perfect Christian, and I'm putting that in air quotes for a reason, for those of you who are listening and can't see the video. So that is today's topic for today's podcast. So yeah, today's question, what makes a Christian a perfect Christian? I'm going to start by explaining that opening quote. So perfection is both a friend and enemy of growth. So seeking perfection can often cause us to avoid forward movement because we feel like we're not at that perfect place with where we are yet. We haven't reached that perfection at that level. So before we move to the next level, we have to get it perfect where we are and everything in order. So that's how perfection can be an enemy of growth, because we kind of get stuck with where we are and we don't just keep going imperfectly and moving forward. At the same time, if we are never seeking that level of improvement and kind of heading towards perfection, we will always just stay where we are as well. So it's got pros and cons here. So yeah, what would it be for a perfect Christian? What would that look like to be a perfect Christian? Does such a thing exist? So that's kind of what we are grappling with today. So Tom, what are your thoughts on this to kind of kick us off?
I feel like my first thought is that Jesus must have been the perfect Christian, and that probably nobody else comes close. And I don't really even know exactly what that means. I just assume that if there is a perfect Christian, it's got to be Jesus.
Yeah.
But like, if I was to, enumerate which qualities made him perfect, I couldn't do that, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it does feel like a little bit of a hard to grasp concept.
for sure. And I feel like too, can you even classify Jesus as a Christian? Because Christian essentially means Christ's follower.
Yeah, true.
And he wasn't technically following himself. But I do get in that other sense that, like, yes, he was the ultimate example of perfection. And in terms of faith. And so, for example, at first Christians were actually called different things. They were a sect of Judaism to start. And some of, like, if you read the Gospel of Acts, it refers to Christians as the way. You could see Jesus as a follower of the way, but can you see him as, like, it's one and the same, but it's also different, if you know what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
So yeah, in a sense, he is the perfect Christian, but in another sense, he's not even technically
he
Christian.
is the only one who almost could not be because you cannot follow yourself. Although I guess anybody before him couldn't follow him either. Mm-hmm. Maybe in some way, but
well, it was the sacrificial system pointed towards him.
Exactly, yeah.
I find this a really interesting question too, because in a sense, we're all perfect Christians because we have our perfection given to us through Christ and through his atonement on the cross. So technically we're all perfect Christians despite also being imperfect. So it's almost like paradoxical in nature, which makes it a really interesting thing to grapple with, because we're both perfect and completely not perfect at the same time and broken.
Mm-hmm.
So
we are perfect, nothing to do with what we've done, but yeah, it's tricky. Because it's like, you can always think of yourself, like, I have some Christian qualities, and I'm sure that they could be better or more prominent in my character or something like that. And I would think I would be closer to a perfect Christian, but it doesn't really matter, almost.
Yeah, that's very true. And like those qualities, it's almost like asymptotic in nature. So for those of you who aren't math nerds, an asymptote is when a graph like forever approaches the line, but it never actually gets there. So it's like, for example, if you have an equation and you're always halving it, well, you can never get to you're never going to actually get to that line.
Zero.
Because you're always going to be halfway closer than you were before. So you continually approach zero, but you never actually get there. So I feel like perfection in terms of our growth, you look at like Galatians and the fruits of the Spirit and things that we're supposed to be growing in: peace, joy, love, patience, self-control, all those things. But we never actually get there. So we're forever approaching perfection, but never getting there in terms of like our sanctification and growth as we become more like Jesus, but we never become Jesus. So it's like that. It's the impossible dream, so to speak. But
so sometimes it also feels like what's that one philosophy where you try to do the most good by all people? It's utilitarianism.
Okay.
So trying to maximize the best overall good or something like that you do. It seems almost like, especially when you get towards like some higher end, any good you do also has negative repercussions, right? So like even if you get a little bit closer, maybe you're doing it for selfish reasons to make yourself feel good or something like that, and that's not utilitarianism. So it feels almost parallel to the utilitarian problem, where you can never be perfectly utilitarianistic. You can never quite be the perfect Christian because, eventually there's some upper bound that we just can't seem to get past.
Yeah. And I think like where this kind of creates a problem too is you also get Christians who are competing with one another to be the better Christian. We maybe not perfect because like it's unapproachable, but like I'm closer than you are, so I'm up here and you're down here, and that makes me better. And
of course, just that comparison shows the flaws in people, and yeah,
and then it makes you think you're close to being the perfect Christian, but
just by thinking that, you get a little bit further away.
Yeah, by being prideful. And but
it does seem an impossibility almost.
But I think what ends up happening, at least from my view and interpretation of kind of what I've seen within different churches, and that you get everyone's trying to be the perfect version of Christianity, and I don't think it's wrong to want to have healthy doctrines and to work on things, but when you start thinking that other Christians are lesser than because they don't believe the same doctrine as you, it becomes this really big problem, because I do think that a lot of Christians, we might not say it out loud that there is such a thing as a perfect Christian, but we treat it like it does exist, and like one form of Christianity is somehow purer than another. So even though it might be asymptotic in nature and impossible to actually be a perfect Christian, we're living in a sense as though it's not, which I think is problematic to how the church plays out, especially in terms of like judgment, and all this judgment comes in terms of how we view other Christians and other Christian groups, other denominational groups, and looking for that like perfect denomination, or even denominational boards, which I don't know how much you know about like church structures, but a lot of churches, so there's like Baptists and Pentecostal and Brethren, those are like denominations, and then within baptism there's like Federal Evangelical Baptist Churches of North America, so that's FEB. There's also the Quebec and Ontario affiliation of churches as well for Baptists. There's like 4, I think, different ones in Ontario of Baptist affiliations. So those are boards. So you get fractions of which denomination is the perfect denomination, and then you get which board of those denominations is the perfect board that's going to make me the closest to being a perfect Christian. And I think that's just not the way of Jesus at all when you look at how he lived his life. Because he was so focused on the individual and the moment, and not and that's not to say that church structures don't have their place, but I don't think one is more holy than the other.
Especially because I'm sure they differ mostly on subjective areas, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really even stresses the point of this asymptotic nature of the perfect Christian, because if there's some subjective portion, how are you ever going to get that part perfect? It's subjective, and we don't know what was the perfect interpretation.
Yeah. And I really like the Wesleyan view as well. John Wesley used to talk about how we're aiming to be 100% right in every individual doctrine, but we know that we're not 100% right in every single that like we can't be 100% accurate in our faith. So we're wrong about something. It's just a matter of what. And independently, each thing we're trying to be the closest, but you know that something you believe is wrong, which I find just an interesting way of looking at it. And
so what do you think about these boards then? Like we agree that they're maybe useful for something, we can get into that, but is it wrong for them to state that one way of interpreting the Bible is right over the other?
I don't think so in terms of the boards, because they have to stand for something, right? So I think it's okay to have your doctrine that you see as like more important as to we'll take on churches if they agree with like these bullet points. But I think where it becomes an issue is if you're going to downput other boards and say that they aren't Christian or has our board. And I don't think that's where like from when I've seen problems arise with this, usually it's from the bottom up, whereas the people are saying, well, my board's better than your board, and your church isn't the right church because they're not with our board. Whereas the boards themselves are just trying to govern a body of believers in the best way that they can. And I do think, like, of course, that does run risks as well. Like if we're able to do it from the ground up, people in power can also do it. But I think if you're trying to run a collective network and bring people together, there needs to be common ground as to what you're bringing them together about. And of course, with all Christians, that Jesus was God and died for us. So that's kind of the common ground between Christians. But when you get to boards, there's going to be different things that they believe in terms of overseeing a selection of bringing those commonalities together. And that's when you get more like niche areas. But I don't think that's necessarily wrong if used in the right way. If you're using it to bring people together, that's great. If you're using it to divide and judge people, that's wrong.
It just seems that, even just having these different groups, like obviously it implies that they think their group is right over the other groups. They're going to be giving groups different funding. It seems like a natural way to separate Christians.
At the same time, though, there are advantages.
What's the benefit? Like, what am I ever thinking? Oh, yes, thank goodness these boards are here to divide Christians into groups. Therefore, I can go to the church that I believe that supports my beliefs the most. Is that?
Well, you get different funding in that through the boards as well, right? So it's having that collective, like if a church needs to close or something, they're connected to a larger church body that can oversee how that process goes. If you run into financial trouble, sometimes they can provide finances until you and kind of keep you afloat until you get to a place where you can be on your own. Yeah, so there are like advantages in terms of just how the structures are and being able to, even in terms of like church discipline or whatnot, you get situations where a pastor needs to be disciplined. It's really hard for a congregation to step up and say, like, what do we do about this? They might say there needs to be discipline here, but how do you oversee that? And it's possible. There's a lot of churches that are just self-reliant churches that don't have affiliation with boards that manage to do these things. But it can be easier when you have a board to be like, hey, we have an issue with our pastor because of this, and we don't know how to deal with it, so you guys can step in and kind of discern what's right, what's a good way to deal with it. And it provides that slightly less biased mindset, because if you're a small church and you're
everybody knows you, and it's hard to be impartial. Sure.
Exactly. So in issues of church discipline and stuff like that, it can be helpful to have a board.
Why not divide these boards geographically as opposed to by denomination or by belief? Or
I think that has historical roots to the Reformation, and when everything started to break off into different denominations. Yeah, because initially it was all the Catholic. Well, there were other groups, but mostly it was the Catholic one, and that was geographical. But then when the Protestant Reformation happened, like in Europe, there was a lot of feuding, and there was a lot of wars geographically because they wanted this geographical area to be Catholic versus Protestant, and that's why a lot of wars happened. And then whoever won out, that geographical area got to be Protestant or Catholic or yeah. So it's like, do we want to create a scenario again if it's geographical that you're having wars over what your area believes, or what your area, I guess, should believe, because the idea that it was the wrong one.
Do wars necessarily have to come from that sort of arrangement? Like, let's just say that we had a Church of Sault Ste. Marie, which covered all Christian groups in Sault Ste. Marie, regardless of denomination within Christianity.
I mean,
would that necessarily lead to war, or?
I don't think it should, but human nature in history, it has. I'm just, I'm not saying that I agree with the fact that it has.
The last time we had a geographical separation that went bad, so maybe that's why we don't do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like there are advantages to that as well, right? And I do think in some early on in missions work, and again, what's early on in missions work? Because missions work has really been around since the start of Christianity. But there was kind of like a missions movement in the early, I think it was like 1700s. I don't know. That could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But
a while ago.
Yeah.
Definite while ago.
When basically Western civilization was taking over the world, there was also a missions movement that went with that. And in those, it was more geographical because, I mean, they had, the goal was kind of, well, let's, like you see the China Inland Mission and stuff like that, where it was like, let's go and convert Chinese individuals and share the gospel with them. So that became more geographical because you're just working with whoever's there, right? And kind of trying to band together and work together rather than groups competing with one another, which did happen as well. They ended up competing with one another, but there were some really beautiful stories of people coming together. And I think in India as well, there was that as well, where missions groups started working together. So there are some really beautiful stories of that. And then there's also times when we're human and we like to compete with one another. Yeah, so it becomes...
It just seems to me like there is a lot of Christian infighting about what is this perfect Christian, essentially, and trying to put your beliefs on others very often about what that might be.
Yeah.
And maybe that has to do with just the fact that even at all levels, higher up, even towards boards, we are divided. And that division is through everything, you know, like it'll be hard for me, even in Sault Ste. Marie, to come across a Pentecostal event at all, because it won't be announced in my church and it won't be in my social circles. And it seems like that's a shame a little bit, because there are Christians that I won't get to talk to or what have you. And our ability to work together between Christian groups will be diminished because our interactions are few and far between. Whereas we could probably do a lot more good if we work together.
Yeah. But when you think of it that way too, it's like, are the boards the issue with that? Or is it kind of, because churches can be working together and be with different boards as well.
For sure.
So yeah, and I think in the Sioux, we are really blessed to have events that do bring different denominations together. I think where our divide is a little bit flawed is between Protestants and Catholics. We don't have as many events that bring things together in that way. But we do have, for example, I volunteered at the pregnancy center for a while, and that is one beautiful ministry that across the board, Catholics and Protestants, kind of every denomination is involved in some way, shape, or form with that organization. We also have the Sioux Missions Expo that happens every couple of years. And that one, again, we don't have as many Catholics involved with that, but we do have most of the Protestant churches in the city come together for that as well. So we are blessed in our area to have certain things where larger cities, I think you would get less of that. Like if you're in Toronto, it's hard for every single church in Toronto, like how many churches are in Toronto, just that alone, to come together and do kind of an event. So I would say it does exist. I do think we do need to do more of it in the Sioux, and I think there are ways to better what we are doing as well in those different areas so that there are more connections. But yeah, I would say compared to some other cities, we are kind of blessed to be a little bit smaller here and have those opportunities. Yeah, back when I was in high school, there was also Uprise that kind of brought denominations together. But I think that as well was mostly Protestant and not Catholic. There are some youth events too in the city that do try and bring the youth groups together, but then it's harder once you're an adult. We don't have as many of those.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I wanted to focus on the boards for a bit there, because I do feel like it'd be a lot easier to work together if your funding was coming from the same place, right?
It's true.
Like if different boards have to communicate about funding and about who's going to be paying for what and to what degree, and maybe one board has slightly more money, does that mean they should be paying more in total? Or, I feel like it really does complicate things and makes it harder for different boards to work together.
Yeah, and there's I have 2 points for that, so I'll start with one. It's difficult in terms of when you have these different bullet points that you believe, where that funding goes often ties to that, right? So if you see different types of outreach has the core of ministry, like for example, maybe one group approaches it food banks, whereas one approaches it, well, just give them money and then they can buy their own food. So that's two different approaches. And I think what happens with these denominational boards is it kind of creates a common approach. So that is one benefit. But at the same time, you end up getting funding going out based on beliefs rather than a region or like an area. So my second point is kind of, and I'm not going to share which I'll keep this as like confidential as possible, but like when churches close, I went to a church closing like their last service recently, and they were talking about how all the funding was going to be going like from the church building being sold and whatnot, and it was the board that had come up and was saying this, and it was going to be put into all these places. Like they had some really great missions work to Quebec and whatnot, which is wonderful and great. And Quebec is struggling in terms of religion right now. So that is great that there's outreach there. But in my mind, I'm also like, as great as that is, there's still people in the Sioux who aren't reached. And all of that funding from that now is going to the board and outside of the city rather than to local ministry. And it's like there's benefits that they're reaching people in Quebec, but at the same time, like there's a cost to that as well, that the money is going outside of the city. Especially like in the Sioux when we have like opioid crisis here. And I know that's kind of across the board, but it's particularly bad in the Sioux. We have a lot of overdoses, especially young people. We've had a lot of teens overdose and suicides within the past couple of years. And I feel like for that money to go outside of the Sioux when there's people here who need the gospel, it kind of burdens me a little bit.
I hear you. I think it's actually a similar problem to like my home church right now is debating on what to do with a lot of money they've gotten over the last little while, whether to do a building expansion, to hire more staff, to pretty much how to spend this money. And I totally get the push that exists within my church to within my congregation, I guess, to keep the money in the Sioux, spend it on a building or hiring. There's a fair amount of pushback on this right now, especially from younger people, because it just doesn't seem like an effective use of our money. Regardless of, they would definitely do some good for Sault Ste. Marie if we were to keep what's looking like dollars in our city. But what is the best use for this money? Going back to our idea of what a perfect Christian is, what would a perfect Christian do with this money? In my mind, we were told to spread the kingdom of God on earth. Mm-hmm. And that involves, bringing new people to God. And wherever we can do that the best with this money is where I think it should go. And that's generally echoed by younger people in our church. But it is a hard thing because, what if us spending this money somewhere else reduces our capability to get money in the future? is one of the concerns that I've heard voiced. I don't know if I entirely buy it, but there are these concerns.
Well,
in general, though, I think you should just go for wherever the money can reach the most people, can save the most people, put it there. Whether it's in your city, in your country, wherever, or if it's donating the money to a different Christian group, even if they have slightly different beliefs than you. If you can reach 100 times more people doing that, I mean, that's got to be worth it, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that that would be a concern that, well, what if we can't get more money in the first place? Because ultimately money comes from God, and that is a very untrusting of God mindset to have.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it from a human perspective, I get it, but also, like, if God's gonna bless you, he's gonna bless you and find a means to do so. And yeah, like, and also I think, like, you're so right, like, money is a tool that we can use to bring the kingdom forward. And having a lot of money is not bad, because sometimes people look at, like, churches that have a lot of money and there's almost like a sense of jealousy from churches that don't have enough money.
Well, there's also the idea that you shouldn't just be investing or whatever, you should be spending and being active with your whatever you've been gifted with.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, like, having a lot of money is great, but it's what do you do with it? How do you steward that? How do you and how do you weigh your options, right? Because sometimes spending a lot of money on a project could yield a lot of fruit, but how do you know? And it just needs to be done so prayerfully as well, and to seek God and what he's doing. But
yeah,
like, and I think part of that too is, like you were saying, especially young people. I feel like young people have a different mindset as to how to reach our generation, because our generation has different approaches to spirituality that some of the older generations might not understand. So we look at something and we're like, this might not be the best way to reach people, because we see where the people that are coming up are, whereas they are still in that mindset of how you would reach people 10, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. I mean, things are changing so rapidly now.
And also, I think it's like, in these generally older people's, to argue for them, I think that that's generally how it used to be done. Things were less globalized back then. You would be less concerned about what was happening in China or India or wherever.
Yeah.
And it'd be much easier, given the lower level of globalization, to save people in your own area,
Well, and I think
whereas now there's a lot of global outreach.
Yeah. And what's different about global outreach now is, before, when you used to pump money into that, you were pumping money into the global outreach, whereas now people are so socially conscious. Like, you see brands like, what is it, 10 Tree, that they plant 10 trees for every one shirt sold, and like Tom's shoes and whatnot. People in our generation look at that and they go, wow, that's so cool, like, that people care. So our generation in the Sioux here might look at, oh, you spent money overseas, wow, there must be a God that you would do that. Like, they see it would be outreach here to do something like that, whereas back in the day it would only be outreach to the area that the finances are going into, if you know what I'm saying. Because I feel like our generation looks at that and goes, wow, these people must have a heart for God, whereas before, that outreach would have not had anything to do with the local people as much.
Yep. And I mean, like, also, I think our generation is just a bit more data savvy, and we're aware of where Christianity is expensive to invest.
That's true.
Investing in North America is expensive per Christian.
Yeah, and
investing in India or China is much cheaper. And like, if you're just looking at the number of people you can save per dollar to bring it,
and not only that, but on top of that, Christianity is dying in North America, whereas in Africa right now it is expanding really fast. There's a lot of growth, and we don't talk about that here. And I actually took this my last semester at school, which was like 2 semesters ago now or something. And yeah, so different areas of the world, Christianity is actually growing, but we get caught in this mindset of it's shrinking because in North America it is shrinking. But if you want to reach more people, reach the people that are receiving it. I mean, you look at the Gospels, and when Jesus sent out the 70 pairs of disciples, they were told to go into cities, and if they weren't receptive, to shake the dust off their shoes and leave. And like, at what point do we say, if they're not receiving what we're saying, take it to people who are going to receive it and invest in the people who not, I mean, everyone needs to hear it, but needs to hear it and it will change their life because they will receive it, versus how many times do we just keep pounding the same door of someone who doesn't want to hear it? And also, how much more does it harden their hearts when we do that, rather than letting God kind of take them through whatever process they need to go through? And like, at what point do we follow that command of Jesus to just shake the dust off our shoes and go?
Yeah, and I know that can be interpreted as maybe like giving up on people here. And I get that, because, maybe if we were to invest all of our money here, we would reach more people here. But it's really about how many people can you reach. It doesn't matter what country they're in or what city they're in or what language they speak. And I feel like people in North America tend to have resources that other people don't have when it comes to faith. There's rarely a city that doesn't have a church.
Yep.
Whereas in China, I wouldn't be surprised if there were many cities that didn't have a church or only had underground churches or what have you.
Yep.
So just creating the first church in a city has to be a valuable thing relative to the 20th, relative to increasing the size of a pre-existing one.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to slight people on one side or another, but you just have to go for where you can reach the most people, I feel.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, souls are important, right? Regardless of the number of souls, every soul independently is important. But yeah, I think we need to be mindful of how we're stewarding things.
Well, also, even if you just look at it like in a long-term equation, if we can reach more Christians tomorrow, then there'll be more Christians to make other Christians the day after tomorrow, right?
That's true.
Whereas if we have really slow growth and we just keep on focusing on North America for forever, while it declines, there'll be fewer and fewer Christians to disciple the people who are willing to hear the message.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I feel like, kind of going back to this idea of like the perfect Christian as well, or like a perfect church body or church board, or all these, and I'm doing all these in air quotes for anyone who's just listening to the audio, but
wherever perfect is.
Yeah. I find that so much North American church growth, which again in air quotes, is actually just people coming from other churches, which is not growth. And we view it as growth because we think our denomination is the right one, or our way of interpreting is the right one. And we saved their lost soul because this church they were at had this one area wrong. Well, their church, and that might even be true, they might have had one completely wrong doctrine, but does that mean they weren't a Christian because they were attending that church? No. Well, I would argue no, they probably still were a Christian, and to just take from other churches is not true growth. It might be church growth of your local church, but it is not church growth of the
church with a capital C. Yeah. And that's actually something our church, I think, is doing. They're looking at transfer growth, and they're seeing it as real growth. And that's actually something that did come up, and we kind of implored them to please ask the new members if they came from a different church or if they were new converts or what have you, because that's going to be an important measure on deciding what we'll do.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and
especially in North America, transfer growth, I think, is interpreted as real growth a little bit too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like, it's great sometimes to have that community, and like, as someone who has been to multiple churches in her lifetime, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to switch churches, but I don't like if I go to a new church and they say we're growing, because it's like, well, I was already a Christian. You didn't really do much for the kingdom by me coming here. And I don't think it's necessarily a wrong thing to switch churches, though, because, like, for example, the church that I switched to in the Sioux most recently, they needed help with their youth program. So I went there with a specific purpose. It wasn't anything against my other church, but it's not like getting someone off the street and introducing them to Jesus. It's a very different thing. Yeah.
And especially in North America right now, where Christianity is on the decline, I'd be really hesitant to interpret any growth as actual church growth without looking into it first. Because obviously that will affect where you want to invest your money in the future. And you need to know what degree of your growth is transfer growth to know where to invest that. So.
And even if only a small portion isn't transfer growth and it's genuine new converts, to look at those stats and see where it's working and what is working in bringing new, like what was it that brought those people to your church, and what programs to, maybe of your own programs even, to put more funding into, rather than just focusing on, well, this has a lot of, this program reaches a lot of people. Okay, but were those all from other churches? Maybe that's not the best program to keep pumping money into, versus if you have one program that's actually most of your new converts came from that maybe should be where your money is going more into, rather than the program that's double the size but taking from other churches.
Yeah, it absolutely startled me when I found out that, my church was thinking about doing all this development and building, and they had no idea where their growth was coming from. It blew me away.
Yeah.
Seems critical.
Yeah. And
there's
also
a bit more introspection there, I suppose.
Yeah, especially because there's so much confirmation bias too, of like, well, we had this one person who was a new convert, so they all must be new converts. Well, have you actually broken it down into stats?
Yeah, especially when their measurement of full is just looking out at the congregation and judging-ish about how many chairs are left. And I mean, you don't even know names at that point. You have to figure that out. That's very important.
Yeah.
So getting back to what a perfect Christian is, I don't know. Someone who follows Jesus? Is it that we're all perfect Christians, or?
Well, again, I would say we're all perfect Christians because we all have that perfectness of Christ, like Christ's righteousness imputed onto us, right? So technically we're all perfect, but none of us are perfect because we can never actually get to that perfection on our own. But then, okay, the other argument too is when we come to die and we actually make that stride to the other side, at that point have we reached perfection? Because some scholars believe that Christian perfection, like when God has you fully sanctified, is when you die, because you have reached as much as you can learn on this side of glory, which is an interesting thought as well. Because then it's almost like, do I want to reach perfection? But yeah, I'm of the mindset that I think we all just have our times, regardless of how close or far we are to perfection. But again, we're all in perfection in Christ. But yeah, that is something that's been thrown around before, and that's an interesting one. And then there are also scholars that believe in total sanctification, meaning that we can become perfect this side of glory in life.
That seems hard to believe.
I'm a life coach, so I believe in constant personal development. And if there's constant personal development, there's always something to be worked on. So
that implies not perfection.
Exactly. But yeah, there are scholars that believe that. So there's that side as well. Yeah, I think one important question to consider too, which you brought this up, Tom, when we were talking about doing this podcast, was what's the line between encouraging others towards that description of like perfection and unhelpful judgment? And I think I was actually talking with some friends a couple nights ago about the difference between discernment versus judgment, and how sometimes we use the word judgment when we actually mean discernment. So discerning whether or not something is good or healthy for someone to be doing versus judging them for it. So there are those moments when you step in and you say to your friends, like, hey, I think this is actually hurting you. And that's more discernment, because of course you can't know for sure, you're not in their shoes, but like you're voicing what you feel would be your discernment. But sometimes we word those moments as more judgment, when that's not what judgment actually is. Judgment is that down-putting and being like, hey, you're doing this and you shouldn't be because it's hurting you, and I know better than you. And that's like a level of judgment versus that actual place of concern that discernment comes from. And there is like that idea in John chapter 8, Jesus talks about how like he judges no one. And what is that level of like, we're also supposed to judge no one. So at what point is saying that there's such thing as a perfect Christian and you're not in that group unhelpful and judgy? And I would say most of the time it probably is, because we're human and we don't have that that pure view on it. And yeah, and then it also comes down to self-judgment can occur with this as well, right? Because if none of us are perfect, we can really start to self-judge in unhelpful ways that keep us and hold us back from what we need to be doing in life.
So going back to the distinguishing judgment from discernment, is that just sort of like there's not really any words that would be associated with that? It's more of just how you are viewing it. Like, let's say I was talking to somebody and I said, I'm worried about X or Y and how it might be affecting you. When is that judgment, and when is that just based on my own perceptions of it as to whether or not I place myself above them or below them with that relation? Or
that's a good question, because it can be based on that, but also just like, I mean, because there are times when you might not actually ever talk to someone, but it's discerning that like this thing's unhelpful to me. So there's like discernment for yourself as well, right? If you feel like someone's living in sin, regardless of whether or not they are, is it going to be helpful for you to be engaging with that level of sin? And at what point do you distance yourself from it versus judge them for it? You know what I mean? Like there's those two. Yeah, like for example, one of the questions that came up in one of my classes was when you're doing missions work, you go to someone's worship service for like an idol that they're worshiping, and there's food being passed around and eaten, and the Bible says like not to eat food sacrificed to idols. But then Paul also talks about how it's more like a conscious issue. So it's like, do you eat the food if they're passing it around, or do you not eat the food? And at what point is it your conscious versus so there's discernment in that as to what you do in that situation, but there can also be judgment if you're judging the people around you who are doing it, or if you judge what another Christian would do in that circumstance. So say we're both Christian, we go and we're at this worship service for I don't know,
a golden pig.
like, okay, a golden pig. I was actually trying to think of an actual god, but you know.
Oh, sorry.
Golden pig. So we go to a golden pig, and they are passing around bread to eat. Well, they worship this golden pig. It's passed to us, and I take it and I think nothing of it and eat it, because I'm like, well, the golden pig, there's no actual spirit to the golden pig. It's not going to do anything to me to eat this thing, and I don't want to offend the people around me. And you decide that you're going to pass because you don't feel right about it. So that's us having two different levels of discernment, or I wouldn't say not two different levels, but two different places of discernment, because I don't want to put one above the other. And that's completely fine if we both do those different things. But if I say, no, Tom, you needed to eat it too, that's me judging you now for it, rather than us saying, hey, we had different opinions about this, different discernment, and we came to a different place, both having that healthy process of grappling with it and trying to figure out what's the best option here. So I think that's the difference between discernment and actually, like, because I still discerned, or sorry, you still discerned not to eat it, knowing that I just did next to you. But you didn't judge me in that. And you could even not even say anything to me, but be judging me in that as well. So it is a little bit about like where you are in that, like your mindset.
I feel like the same scenario could play out. You know, two people could say the same sentences to each other, and one could be discernment and one could be judgment, just based on the intentions. You know.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely tricky.
Yeah, and I think in terms of like where this line is between encouraging others to be closer to perfect Christians and that unhelpful judgment is a lot about motive and what's going on in your heart. And also I think how you word things, because if I was like, hey, Tom, like maybe you should have, or I'm going to say it's probably going to be the other way in this scenario. So if you're like, hey, Katie, maybe you shouldn't have eaten that, and you're coming from a caring place, but if you're like, Katie, you shouldn't have eaten that, and I'm not going to judge you for doing that, but I think you shouldn't have, that's my discernment. But if you're coming at it from a more loving wording, I'm going to be more receptive to that as well and probably think it over more rather than assume that you're judging me even if you're not.
That's tough. Trying to divide that line between encouragement and judgment. I mean, because it feels like, you definitely could be saying the exact same sentences, and it just depends on your intentions.
Yeah.
And of course, that has to then fall on whoever's hearing it to interpret it, hopefully the way that you intended it, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, this line between encouraging others, even if it is through discernment and you're not judging, and that unhelpful, what's going to come off as judgment is, are you letting them live to the fullest person that God created them to be? So for example, for me, one thing that comes up with this a lot is I am a female in ministry and some denominations that's not okay. And females can't speak, they can't pastor, they can't do those things. Whereas I'm someone who believes that we can and we are capable and we're equipped with God to do those things. But if there's a level of judgment there or keeping me back from what God is, I feel God's calling me into, and yes, I might wake up someday and feel like it's wrong and that I was misled, but that's my journey, not your place to do that. So even if it's coming from this place that they feel is, and it's, I wouldn't even say they feel, it's genuine discernment on their part. They're not trying to judge. But if it's keeping me from who I feel called to be, that's a problem. Or like, so this Sunday, I actually got asked to help answer a question in the question and answer portion of the sermon, which for me, as a woman coming from a background where women can't do that, I was like,
oh yeah.
Yeah, well, no, like, okay, probably a little bit of pride in there, but like overall, I was just like feeling so blessed and like, but baffled, and then to look at how men have these experiences where they get to practice that gifting, but I haven't been able to in these other contexts. But for me, there was so much self-judgment after as to, was it okay? And like, I was called upon and asked to, and I was following up a request, but there's still that part of me, and like consciously I'm like, yes, I feel like it's fine, but then there's this part of me that grapples with that past of like, if this was in another context, man, like I would have been like smacked and like feeling like, but when I really get to the heart of it and pray in that, I feel like it's okay for me to do that, but now I'm fighting with that somebody else's discernment that's not even my discernment. Yeah. So it's like, where is that line between encouragement and trying to help someone else along their journey and it turning into unhelpful judgment, whether it's coming from a good place or not?
Because I feel like you almost have to know how they would receive it, or at least have some sort of guess.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there are like sometimes when what would be genuine encouragement from me wouldn't be received that way. And you kind of just have to know that.
Yeah.
Whether or not encouragement is inherently good or bad, it would have been bad in some contexts. Or it would not have been heard as encouragement anyways. It would have been heard as judgment or what have you.
What's really interesting when I hear that is I think of like the life of Jesus and how differently he spoke to different people.
Yeah.
And it's like taking the time to get to know what is going to be helpful for you to say to someone and what's not, even if it is coming from that place of what you intend as encouragement, and being able to discern that. And I think people who have the spiritual gift of encouragement are actually really good at that. And I think it's something we can all practice, is getting to know the language that each person speaks in terms, it's almost like knowing someone's love language. It's like their encouragement language, like what is actually going to be beneficial here.
What will be interpreted as encouragement, what will be interpreted as judgment, or
And at the same time too, sometimes what we interpret as judgment is kind of on us because we haven't done our own self-work to work through some of our own past baggage, or something someone said to us when we were 6 or 7 years old that we never got over. So I do think there is a level of for those of us wanting to be encouraged, also trying to listen and hear what's being said. So for example, I often get told by women like, oh, I can see you having a lot of kids and I know God's just gonna give you a lot of kids in life. And for me, someone who doesn't want biological kids, that is like, I used to hear that and I would be like, that's not encouraging. Like that puts me off of God, because I'm like, oh, God's gonna make me do something that I don't like, that
want to do.
And it makes me feel like God's gonna punish me. Not that kids are punishment, but like just for me personally, it freaks me out. Like the thought of having like a huge family of kids. And that's not to say I might never have kids. Like I might decide that I want to have one or two, but a large family
it's
like
not
that,
something that's encouraging for you tomorrow or today.
Yes, but I've been able to work through my own baggage with that a little bit. And now when a woman tells me that, what I hear is her saying, God's going to bless you in life. But that's what she acquaints with blessing, and that's not what I acquaint with blessing. So on the other end of it, being able to hear what people are actually saying and listen for what the heart of what they're getting at, rather than what they're outwardly saying. So there's that side of it, as well as when you're being the encourager, trying to speak to what's going to speak to that person's heart. So,
and to be fair, you can only ever control one side of that equation, you know.
Yeah.
And I think part of knowing how the other person will hear it is knowing how open they are to reinterpreting what you're saying, as you did with this childhood whatever statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely part of it is just meeting people where they're at.
For sure. Which I think is like ultimately the most beautiful thing about humanity, is when we can just meet people with where we are and kind of have that common ground, even when there's differences.
Very many differences, yeah.
Like we were talking before about church boards and everything, like ultimately that is true unity, when you can meet each other knowing that there's differences there, and still have that communication and that love, and try and bridge that gap.
Agreed. So takeaways: perfect Christian. There probably isn't one, but maybe we all are. There.
Well, yeah.
It depends on your perspective, of course.
Yeah.
In one way we all are, in another way we all aren't. Or,
yeah. And we all are through Christ, not of our own accord, I would add to that.
Exactly, yeah.
But, yeah. And also the growth towards becoming a perfect Christian, I would say, is asymptotic, which again is you're never fully going to approach it, but you're always getting closer.
And of course, there's some subjective element in that, and we should try to be aware of that and let that humble us a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and ultimately, we want to be coming from a place of love and not judging each other, because judgment's never helpful.
Even though that distinguishing that is hard sometimes.
Yeah. So, thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate your time today. Hope you got something out of this. If you have any questions, write them below. Email us. My email is Katelyn.Townsend93@gmail.com, and Katelyn is Katelyn, and Townsend is TOWNSEND @gmail.com. So send us your questions, and we will continue on with this topic later if you have lots of questions on it, and if not, we will move on to something else. Hope it was beneficial to you, and thank you for your time. Have a great day.